Well, hello. It's really good to be with you at Creation Fest today. My name is Andy Bannister, Director of the SOLAS Centre for Public Christianity, based up in Scotland. And in an ideal world, it would have been absolutely fantastic to have been with you in person this year. But for various reasons, obviously pandemic related, and the way that Creation Fest has been restructured this year, because of that, I'm not able to be with you. It's very sad, actually. It's about the first year in a long time that I haven't been down in Cornwall. Hugely looking forward to next summer and being back in person. But in the meantime, never mind, we can still dig into this really exciting and crucial topic we have to think about today, and I can just do it for you in pixelated form. Not quite the same as being there in Cornwall with the sunshine and the cream teas and everything else, but I hope it will still find it helpful. And you know, when the Creation Fest team asked me to speak on this topic, we're going to look at in this seminar, the whole question of how we can find hope in a world of suffering, I was delighted to say yes to that topic because it's such an important title. It's an important title at the best of times, but it's certainly an important title given all that we have lived through in this last 18 months or so. How can we find hope in times like these? Well, of course, your answer to the question of how you can find hope, indeed the answer to the deeper question, in fact, if there is even hope actually out there to be found, your answer to that question really, in a sense, I think, hinges on actually a far deeper question that lies behind the title of today's seminar, whether you can find hope in these difficult times, in times of suffering and pandemic and so on. I think really the question behind that is the question, is there a God? And if there's a God, what is God like? So many of the answers, the biggest questions in life, such as questions about suffering, turn on that question. Let me illustrate what I mean for you. For example, if we live in a purely atheistic, godless universe, if we live in a universe in which there is no God, there is no meaning, there is no purpose, we are just atoms and particles in motion, then we really are forced to confront head-on what the atheist cosmologist Lawrence M Krauss once famously said. He said, we human beings, we are just a 1% bit of pollution in the universe. We are completely insignificant. So there's a nice kind of bit of motivational speech for you today. If you were feeling, overconfident or perhaps getting a bit sort of full of yourself, here's Lawrence to just bring you down to size. From an atheist perspective, that is all you are, a 1% bit of pollution in the universe. If the atoms that were busy being human beings decided to just spend their time doing something else, the universe would simply not care. And Lawrence's atheism there, it's bleak, but I appreciate his honesty of what follows of atheism is true. Well, that has terrific implications, doesn't it, for everything from human rights and justice to love and relationships and so on. On the other hand, if Lawrence is incorrect, if we don't live in an atheistic universe, if there is some kind of God, then of course that changes absolutely everything. So that's the first question that kind of lies behind today's topic of hope and suffering. Is there a God, and if so, what kind of God are we talking about? But of course, the other massively important question out there is, what do we do about suffering? And it occurs to me that suffering is the great leveler. We live in a culture where there's lots of talk in our culture right now about privilege and power and who has what and so on. But you know what? Suffering is the great leveler. Because it doesn't matter how much power or privilege or money or resources or influence you have. It doesn't matter your race or your sex or your gender, your sexuality, your politics. None of those things matter, because all of us, every human being will at some point in his or her life face suffering, whether it directly affects you or whether it affects people that you care about. So all of us, actually, if we're going to be kind of well-rounded, thoughtful human beings, need to think about suffering a little bit. How do we respond to it when it comes in our lives or in the lives of others? How do we live with it? And, no matter what religion you profess, or if you profess no religion, if you would put yourself in the atheist box, we still have to think about suffering. It's something that confronts all of us. But of course, I am not unaware that we are asking questions about suffering and so on in a particular context right now. We've had the COVID crisis and pandemic. We're still at the kind of tail end of this, and thus we are in a cultural moment right now, aren't we, where questions about suffering and so forth have really come to the forefront in a way perhaps they haven't for some years. For a long time we've been able to live very comfortable lives. Most of us haven't thought about these kind of big questions perhaps, and along comes once in a lifetime pandemic, and it kind of changes everything. We are living through very difficult and very distressing times, and although historically pandemics come around about once every 50 years or so, for most of us this is our first experience of anything like this. And maybe for some of you watching this, maybe for many of us, our work or our study, our social lives, our career, our families, all of those things have been turned upside down. Maybe some of you watching this have experienced health issues or have friends who have. Maybe you've experienced bereavement if you've had friends or family whose lives have been lost either through COVID or through the knock-on effects with the NHS not being able to deal with other things. So what I want to do over the next half an hour or so in this webinar is to kind of use the COVID-19 pandemic as a way into exploring these much bigger questions of suffering and the questions of God. The pandemic gives us like a window into our theme. It will keep us grounded, and I also hope some of what I share today will be helpful, especially for those of you watching who have found these times difficult, disorientating or distressing. Well, as I say, the COVID pandemic raises all kinds of questions, not least the spiritual questions, and we'll come to those in a moment, but it actually raises some other not unimportant questions that will perhaps help us give again a bit of context to questions of suffering and so on. For example, the COVID pandemic has raised questions about science, hasn't it? Especially about science and about suffering and the limits of science. You see, for some time now, our society has encouraged us to assume that science is the answer to every question. Early on in the pandemic, scientists told us, right, or rather politicians told us, they were following the science and looking to science to provide the silver bullet, the magical answer to every problem the pandemic raised. Here where I live in Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, our First Minister, famously came out and she said, "Science will save us." Which is I thought a very almost religious way of putting it, actually. But then, of course, as the pandemic has gone on, it's turned out that different scientists disagreed with each other, and actually there was no such thing as the science with a capital T and a capital S. It's turning out that things are a lot more complicated than we first thought. Not least, it's turning out that many of the biggest decisions we've had to face as a country weren't actually scientific, but were moral or political or ethical. Interesting, eh? Another question that I think the pandemic has raised that's not inconsequential when it comes to questions about suffering and so on is the COVID pandemic has helped remind us that human beings are both good and bad. For example, during the pandemic there have been tremendous heroes, haven't there, like our NHS staff and key workers, or there were people like the veteran Tom Moore, the 100-year-old army veteran who raised millions a year or so ago doing sponsored walks around his garden to raise money for the NHS. And there was almost a moment of national grief when Tom passed away at the ripe old age that he made. Or you have the Italian Catholic priest, Father Giuseppe Berardelli, who, according to many reports, made headlines when he caught coronavirus, but ended up in hospital where resources were limited. And according to many accounts, when he caught coronavirus and there were not enough ventilators to go around, he willingly sacrificed his life by saying, "You can take my ventilator and use it for another patient." And many people heard his story and were deeply moved by what he did. But then, as well as the heroes, of course, there have also been the villains. Early on in the pandemic, people hoarded toilet rolls. They panic-bought food with no thought of others. They made unnecessary trips to Durham. They got caught on CCTV having affairs in their offices, to just pick on one particular government minister who's made headlines just as I'm recording this. We have seen the villains in all this, as well as the heroes. And it's very easy to sort of divide the world into good and bad and go, well, I'm glad I'm one of the good guys, I'm glad I'm not one of those naughty people. But maybe life isn't isn't as simple as that. I'm very struck by a very honest remark by the novelist and screenwriter Nick Hornby, who, as far as I'm aware, has no religious faith, but has thought long and hard about the human condition. Nick once said these words. He said, I'm a good person. I'm a good person in most ways, but I'm beginning to think that being a good person in most ways doesn't actually count for anything very much if you're a bad person in one way. Well, on top of those questions, then there's the question that I've long been fascinated with, which is why we struggle so much with suffering. I mean, have you noticed this, right? When suffering strikes, as it has for many of us in the pandemic, we immediately start asking why questions. Even my secular friends, don't just sit there and go, oh, well, that's just life. But we naturally begin as human beings asking the why questions. Why did I get ill? Why was it my family that lost a loved one? Why did I lose my job? When life goes wrong, we don't instinctively reach for the secular answer. I mean, the secular answer, if we were to follow the M Krauss view of the world, would be, well, we're just atoms in motion, right? And sometimes those atoms bang together in ways that are convenient to us, and sometimes they bang together in ways that are inconvenient to us. But we don't instinctively reach for that answer, do we, when suffering strikes? Rather, we tend to ask, actually almost sort of spiritual questions, really. We instinctively ask the why questions. But if atheism is true, there is no why. The universe is simply doing its thing. There is no way it's supposed to be. And of course, related to that is the question we're thinking about today about hope and despair. How do we avoid despair? How do we avoid despair? How do we find hope and meaning, purpose, something worth living for in the face of suffering? And again, another atheist journalist whose writings I quite enjoy, Douglas Murray. No Christian faith, as far as I'm aware. In fact, Douglas calls self-identifies as an atheist quite regularly in his writings. But he wrote this in the middle of the second lockdown. He wrote these words in a newspaper article. He said, "Where do we find purpose? Where do we find purpose?" There were many oddities. There were many oddities about the world that was ours, but one of the oddest was that it chose to leave this question essentially unaddressed. And he's right. For so long our society has bounced along in recent decades, just obviously ignoring the question of purpose and what we are here for. And I think that question has got bigger and bigger, and the silence more and more deafening, particularly as we've moved into the pandemic. And this really affects people. This is not just theoretical. One of my colleagues was recently chatting with a friend of hers, and when she asked how her friend was doing, she kind of expected her friend to say, actually, I'm okay, because her friend's got an excellent job. She was furloughed for a few months, but then is shifted to home working. That's given her much more time to spend time with her family and her kids, even while her salary has stayed where it is. And her friend is pretty middle class. So my friend expected her friend to say, "Oh, it's great actually. Surprisingly, I've really come through this okay." But rather, what her friend actually said to my friend was that she couldn't bring herself to even talk right now because she was feeling totally overwhelmed, utterly despairing, and could barely bring herself even to get out of bed these days. Life, she said, is overwhelming. It's just overwhelming. Do you know, I've had conversations like that with people. Maybe you have too. Or maybe you're watching this and you would say, that's me. I feel that life is overwhelming. I hear those kind of words often as I talk to people or read the news, kind of a growing sense of despair in much of our society, I think, stemming from the fact that the pandemic has kind of stripped all the usual distractions away. The things that we normally use to help us forget about the big questions of life, they've kind of gone and been messed up, and we've been forced to ask ourselves some quite uncomfortable questions. And, for all the talk of this being the new normal, after, where are we now, almost 18 months, this is not new and it ain't normal. So I think people are hurting as suffering strikes. So what do we do with all of this? Well, another atheist for you, Friedrich Nietzsche, arguably one of the most famous atheists of the last couple of hundred years, certainly possessor of one of the most amazing moustaches in the history of philosophy. And Nietzsche, very hard-nosed atheist, but also said some very interesting things. And on one occasion, he said these words that I've long found fascinating and actually helpful to think about in the context of suffering. Talking about suffering and how we get through it, Friedrich Nietzsche, this very committed atheist, he says, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." And what he's basically saying, right, he's saying that when suffering strikes or difficult circumstances come along, if you have found a kind of purpose to life, if you found meaning in life, if you found something bigger that truly answers your why questions, that gives you a why to live for, then you are going to be able to face the storms of life massively better than someone who hasn't. And of course the irony is that despite the fact he was an atheist, and despite the fact we live in what is increasingly a secular society, I think our secular society has basically failed to answer Nietzsche's question. It's certainly done its best to offer people false hopes. Secularism has talked about, has offered people the hope of money, work, sport, health, sex, happiness, politics, for those who are into all that sort of stuff. But all those things ultimately fail if you try to base your hope in life in them. And they fail for a reason that David Foster Wallace identified. Who is David Foster Wallace? Well, he was a Pulitzer Prize nominated novelist. Not a man of any particular religious faith, but like many novelists, reflected a lot on humanity and life's big questions. And in an essay he wrote towards the end of his life, he said something really interesting, particularly interesting, as I say, because as he hasn't got any kind of religious faith. So he's coming at this question from a secular perspective. But with that in mind, listen to what he says. David Foster Wallace writes, he says, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of god or spiritual type thing to worship is that kind of pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they're where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. If you worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, then you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die 1,000,000 deaths before they finally plant you. If you worship power, then you will feel weak and afraid. You'll need ever more power over others to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, and you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out, and so on. Well, I think what David is getting at there is that we have this tendency in life to worship the wrong things, quite frankly. All of us worship something, and we have a tendency to orientate our lives around all the kind of things he lists there: our appearance, our power, our influence, our intellects, and so on. And I think one of the things that the pandemic has done, and the reason I think it's caused such trouble for many people, is it's come along and it's exposed all the secular gods and false idols that we are tempted to worship, and it's exposed them as utterly hopeless. All the things that people normally charge towards, for comfort, the excitement of, student life, a career that you love, and, spending time in the office with colleagues that you enjoy getting on with, retail therapy, parties, holiday in France, freedom and friendships, work and career, and all of those things that we often kind of cling on to for comfort and hope. Well, if they haven't been toppled entirely, boy, they have been weakened considerably during the pandemic. It's almost as if society has been kind of running up the stairs of progress, one foot in front of the other, getting better and better and better, and then suddenly we have raised our foot to the next step, and suddenly, lo and behold, it's not there anymore, and we've tripped and we've fallen. And I think the secular world simply has no answers to the question that Nietzsche raises about the need we have for a why, especially in times of suffering. Those false gods that David Foster Wallace identified, they have shut up shop, they have barricaded the doors, they put closed signs on them, and they have abandoned their worshippers at their time of greatest need. As my colleague Christy Mayer, also regular at Creation Fest, put it on one occasion, she said, secular gods, they make bad lovers. They leave us just when we need them the very most. Well, a generation or so ago, when a national disaster or tragedy struck a country, people would have flocked into churches. I remember that happening when 9/11 struck. I can remember churches being full as people processed that question: what is going on? I also remember it happening, funnily enough, when Princess Diana died. I can remember living through that kind of cultural moment when suddenly people just felt this need to engage with the spiritual in some way. And people have instinctively historically, and even in recent history, they've kind of reached for God in times of crisis. Now, I notice that our political leaders have not yet called for a national day of prayer for the current pandemic, but I do find it fascinating that nevertheless people seem to have reached instinctively for spiritual answers when the old certainties are shaken. For example, many newspapers and media outlets reported how, in the early days of the pandemic here in the UK, many people took part in religious services online. The numbers jumped. The Guardian, no friend, that newspaper is not a friend to religious people, but even the Guardian ran the story that 1 in 3 people aged 18 to 34 had started engaging in religious services online. While the New Statesman, a left-leaning political magazine, even ran, I think it was actually a cover article entitled "How Coronavirus is Leading to a Religious Revival." Just fascinating to see these media sources, newspapers, magazines, often hostile to Christianity, actually speaking very positively about how astounding numbers of people were reaching out. Around the same time, across culture, another phenomenon I noticed, Russell Brand, that absolutely kind of crazy but always interesting to watch comedian, he posted a little video where he asked, why are so many people Googling how to pray? And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people watched that video. I think within the first 24 hours. I think it may have over 1 million views now of Russell sort of pontificating on why people are reaching out, for God at a time like this. He actually then went on to do a debate with a fellow comedian, Ricky Gervais, who is an atheist. I think Russell's not really sure what he believes. And the trailer alone for their interaction on questions about God got almost 2 million views. Well, around the same time, sales of the Bible grew 50% in the first few months of lockdown, and over the last year or so, millions more people than usual have downloaded Bible apps onto their phones and digital devices. What is going on? Well, I think people have been desperately looking for an answer to Nietzsche's question, right? Looking for a why to live for that's robust enough for the times that we're living through. And I think when you start asking that kind of question, you very rapidly get from the question of suffering to the question of God. So where is God in the middle of the coronavirus crisis? Where is God in the middle of any suffering? Why might God allow suffering in the first place? There's a question. And how does God help us find hope? Which is what we're thinking about today. Well, let's start with the whole question of whether suffering disproves God. Sometimes people can be tempted to go that direction. I have talked to many atheist friends who, when I gently ask them, okay, why is it you don't believe in God, will say to me, well, Andy, why would you believe in a God? Look at the suffering and evil in the world. Surely, that proves beyond a doubt there is no God. Well, things aren't in fact that simple. They never invariably are, and they certainly aren't that simple. Because, of course, one of the first problems is that if you wish to say that suffering is an obviously knockdown blow against God's existence, then you have to kind of scratch your head somewhat and go, well, how did belief in God ever arise in the first place? As the late Oxford philosopher C.S. Lewis once remarked in his famous book on suffering and the Christian faith, The Problem of Pain, Lewis writes, he says, look, if the universe is so bad, or even half so bad, as the pessimists claim, how on earth did human beings ever come to attribute it to the activity of a wise and good creator? Human beings are fools, perhaps, but hardly as foolish as that. The direct inference from black to white, from evil flower to virtuous root, from senseless work to a workman infinitely wise, staggers belief. And remember, of course, that our ancient ancestors, who for whom religion was such a part of their lives, as it is for most people in the world today, actually, it's just the West where, secularism has grown in recent years. Religion first got going among countries and cultures and peoples who knew far more about suffering than we did. We are pretty cosseted here in the Western world in terms of our lives compared to the lives of people in many parts of the world where it's tough and it's brutal. They are confronted by death and disease and whatnot on a close up and personal on a day-to-day basis, yet they still believe in God. We either have to conclude that the rest of humanity hasn't got a clue what's going on, which looks dreadfully culturally imperialistic, or maybe it's not as simple as suffering disproves God. And of course, you're left with another issue here, aren't you? If you toss God out the window. If you say, well, I'm suffering and it's terrible and I can't bear it, so I'm going to take God and throw God away, you're still left with the suffering. Denying God doesn't take the suffering away. If you are grappling with loss or bereavement or sadness or despair or illness or financial ruin, any of those things, whatever it is you're wrestling with, and you decide you want nothing to do with God, look, I understand why you might feel that, but it doesn't help you solve the problem of suffering. All you've done is remove a very powerful resource to help deal with it. I remember learning this lesson very much the hard way myself when in my early 20s I went through a very, very difficult part of my life. I got stress and burnout from working far too hard on too many things at once. That then actually led to depression, and for 6 months it felt like life was not worth living. Thankfully I had an excellent GP who quickly got me onto some antidepressants, which I tried. That didn't really work. I then tried counselling, which helped a bit more. But I remember through those early horrible weeks until finally, with lots of help, I slowly began to get on top of things. I remember thinking, the one thing, even in the midst of horrible depression and panic attacks and anxiety and everything else, the one thing it never actually occurred to me to do was consider turning away from God. Because quite frankly, God was the one thing I found myself hanging on to when things got really, really crap. Everything else is going wrong, but the one certainty amidst everything else was God, even though I still had some big questions. And as somebody who has been now a Christian, for a follower of Jesus for over 30 years, through periods like that which were horrendous, and also through the ups as well as the downs, I am absolutely fully convinced that not merely is Christianity a certain rock in uncertain times, but I'm also fully convinced that Christianity has some very unique things to say about God and about suffering. And I want to leave you with four key ideas that I hope will help you, or help you help others if you share this material with others. And these were 4 ideas that helped me and have helped me over the last 30 years or so when I faced times of difficulty. So the first thought I want to share with you is this: that it matters when it comes to the question of suffering and the question of God. It matters very much which God we are talking about. When we ask why does God allow suffering, or where is God in the midst of suffering, it matters which God we're talking about, right? Because if God is a monster who loves to see us squirm, a kind of celestial Stalin or Pol Pot, then suffering is explicable. Or if God is a distant, remote God, a God who kind of wound up the clockwork of the universe and then disappeared off and never be seen again, then again we're kind of stuck, because that God isn't here to talk about. And the reason I mention that is it's important to remember that the major religions of the world differ tremendously on these questions. You see, some of the religions in the world will tell you that suffering is an illusion, doesn't really exist. There are many Eastern religions that say, yeah, you think you're suffering, but it's all an illusion. There are other religions that tell you, well, the reason you're suffering is because of karma. It's your fault that you're suffering. In a previous life, you did something bad, so it's your fault. Or even worse, actually, is when you see someone else suffering, there are Eastern religions that will say, well, don't give them too much sympathy because it's justice. They're suffering because of what they did in the previous life. And there are other religions that will say the reason you're suffering is simply because it's God's will. God is all-powerful, and he can do what he likes. And what he likes to do is to make you suffer. And there are religions practiced by billions of people today that take those views. The Bible, however, claims something rather different. The Bible claims that God is a God of love, a God who created us for a relationship with him and a relationship with one another. And so he created us with the ability to love, which meant he created us not as robots or automata, but he didn't pre-program us to obey, but he gave us the gift of freedom, because love requires freedom. And without true freedom, we would never know love. And that's a unique gift of the God of the Bible. So it matters which God we're talking about. Secondly, the Bible is actually very honest that the world is not the way it's supposed to be. Now that may sound obvious, but of course it doesn't follow from atheism. On atheism, you can't say, well, the world shouldn't be this way, because there's no way the world should be. simply the atoms and particles in the universe, including the atoms and particles that make up you and I. They're just following the blind, deterministic laws of physics and doing their thing. That similar view actually follows from some other religions. For example, in Islam, mainstream Islam has generally taught for 1400 years that that everything is simply as Allah ordained it. Everything that happens in the world, for good or for evil, is happening because God has literally pre-programmed it and ordained it. For the Bible, on the other hand, the Bible says something radically different. The Bible rejects both the atheistic answer and the Islamic answer, and the Bible says, well, actually something has gone wrong. Something has gone wrong with God's good creation. Evil and suffering are an alien intrusion. They're almost like a cancer, as it were, in God's good world. So where did they come from? Well, the Bible explains what happens when human beings rebelled against God back at the beginning of creation, when humanity rejected not merely God, but wanted, quite frankly, to be God in his place. And, that trend runs down to the present day. It's sobering, isn't it, that, if you're an atheist and you want to throw God out, if you're honest, what you want to do is simply erect yourself as God in his place. And that's sobering to realise how much we're caught up in the problem, because one of the realities that hits you if you're honest and you begin reflecting on suffering and the evil in the world is how much we are personally tangled up in it. Think of Nick Hornby's quote that I gave you at the top of the talk. Fascinatingly, this applies to bigger issues in our world too, right? There's a tendency sometimes when we look at things like pandemics, disease, natural disasters, environmental chaos and so on, we like to try and label those suffering, and we separate them from things like crime and injustice and stuff which we tend to label evil. But maybe it's not so simple. Maybe actually our tendency to mess things up as human beings thoroughly implicates us in everything that's broken in our world. There's a gentleman called Gus Speth, who is one of the US's leading climate scientists, now works for the United Nations, probably one of the top experts in climate change in the world today. Very, very, very eminent scientist. And in an interview he gave a few years ago, he said something really interesting. And as far as I know, he's got no religious faith, but again, he's somebody who's thought a lot about our world and humanity's place in it and so forth. But listen to what he says. He says, I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address those problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. Fascinating, isn't it? How much humanity is caught up in even the bigger issues of suffering we see in our world. And none of us escape, right? Because if we are honest, all of us can be greedy, we can be selfish, we can be mean-spirited, we can be apathetic. All of us are caught up in the fact that we have broken faith with God, and we have damaged our relationships with each other, and we have damaged creation itself, says the Bible. Which, as I say, is interesting, right? Because when we see suffering, our instinctive reaction is not to sigh, oh, well, we're just a 1% bit of pollution in the universe. Atoms are just doing what atoms would do. But we protest, right? When we see suffering and evil in the world, our natural reaction is to say, hang on, that's not right. And the Bible tells you that cry of your heart is absolutely correct. It isn't right. The world is not the way it should be. But you can't get there from atheism. You can get there from Christianity. Well, the third idea, then, 2 to go, is that God has done something about the root cause of the suffering. You see, it strikes me, right, in a world when there's suffering, a world in which there is pain, what we need is not something said about the problem, but something done. If God just sat up there in heaven and went, well, let me give you a pamphlet or a lecture on suffering and the philosophy of suffering and so on, that would be, quite frankly, a total waste of time. Now, God could, of course, deal with the problem another way too. He could also deal with the problem by removing us. Given the mess that humanity has made of this world, our relationships with each other and everything, one might understand God coming along and kind of snapping his fingers, as it were, and saying, right, I'm going to replace human beings with insects and we're going to start again. That would solve the problem. Equally, turning us into robots would solve the problem, pre-programming us to do exactly as we should do and just follow our script. He could remove our freedom. and we'd no longer be free to cause suffering. But of course, we'd no longer be free to love either. So how might a God who wants us to be loving, a God who is self-loving, how might he respond? How might he deal with the problem of suffering and evil without removing us in the process? Well, you might expect a loving God to respond to what he sees around us with compassion. We expect loving people to be compassionate people. Compassion is the obvious response to suffering, right? We move deeply when we see examples of compassion. So I wonder if God might respond that way. Well, compassion is an interesting word. The word compassion actually consists of two Latin words, com, that means with, and passion, meaning patai, rather, meaning suffer. And so to be truly compassionate, if you're a truly compassionate person, it means you help in such a way that it actually costs you dearly, that you end up suffering alongside the person you want to help. You know, maybe you're walking home from work one night and you see someone shivering in a shop doorway. It's a freezing cold evening, that they're homeless, they're not got enough clothing. Now you could just give them some money or walk on by, or you could walk on by and feel sorry for them. Neither of those things are really compassionate because they haven't cost you anything. Well, the money's cost you a bit, but not that much. But what about if you actually, took off your big thick winter jacket and you gave that to that person, with a result that not only have you given a financial gift, you then end up walking home and catching a chill because of what you did for another person. Or maybe you even invite them to come and stay in your home and offer space for that person. Now you're taking a risk because you don't know their background and what they're like. You're putting, your safety on the line. You are committing. You are suffering. You are being compassionate. And this is what the Bible says that God has done. Because the very heart of the Bible's message is the news, the good news of a God who hasn't just said something about suffering, a God who has dealt in ivory tower theologies in a world of pain, a God who sat up there and said some interesting things, but hasn't done anything. Rather, we have a God who, in the cross of Jesus Christ, has done something. Hasn't just said, has done something about evil and suffering. A God who has taken the very worst that evil can do head on. And the Bible says, and Christians believe, has defeated it ultimately when he went to the cross in the person of Jesus and gave his life to deal with the evil and the suffering and the pain that has taken root in each of our hearts. And the Bible says that in Jesus took all of that pain and all of that suffering and all of that evil that we have done to ourselves and each other into himself, and it was nailed to the cross with him. And Christians believe that in Jesus' death and resurrection, as he bursts forth from the grave, defeating the ultimate enemy that is death, in that there is a rescue plan God offers you and I that is both the ultimate answer to evil and an ultimate answer to suffering and death. And then lastly, fourthly and finally, the key idea I want to leave you with is that the God of the Bible does not desert us. Doesn't desert us when suffering comes. Yes, God has defeated the power of evil and suffering on the cross. Its days are numbered. We can be confident that evil and suffering are not the last word. Rather, that love is the last word because of Jesus' resurrection. But nevertheless, we may still experience suffering and pain in the here and now. But the Bible offers something unique when we go through those times. Because unlike those secular gods that David Foster Wallace talked about, and that we're tempted to worship, success, money, fame, power, image, false gods that let us down and frankly sneer at us when we need them the most, the Bible tells us that God can be with us in the darkest of valleys. He can be with us in the loneliest of times, and that claim has been battle tested through 2,000 years of lived Christian experience. I battle tested it when I went through depression in my 20s. My wife and I battle tested it when we wrestled with miscarriages in our family about 10 years ago. We have put that claim to the test, as have hundreds, thousands, and millions of Christians throughout history, that we do not go through suffering alone, but we can know the real presence of God with us. In fact, one of the most famous verses of the Bible, 23rd Psalm, beloved both by Jewish people and by Christians too, we read these words. God says to us in that verse of the Bible, even when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil. I fear no evil, O Lord, for you are with me. I have long appreciated the Bible's honesty about pain and suffering. Unlike atheism, which would say there is nothing wrong with suffering ultimately, it may be inconvenient to us, but there's nothing wrong with it. Or unlike other religions that try to explain suffering as an illusion, or as a result of your bad karma, you're suffering because it's your fault, the Bible is very honest. It doesn't shy away from describing how the world is broken, as are human beings, but it also holds out the hope based on the concrete certainty of Jesus' resurrection that suffering and evil will not have the last word, because God has put a rescue plan into effect. Because unlike those secular gods that have deserted us, secular gods that maybe some of you have tried to worship, maybe some of you watching this have tried, if you are honest, to make a god out of your career, or your bank balance, or your sex life, or your pleasure, or whatever it is, and those secular gods always let you down. But the God of the Bible, by contrast, has done something about the problem of suffering, acting dramatically in and through Jesus to begin his plan to heal the world, but more importantly to heal us. Where is God in the midst of suffering? Well, God hasn't moved, actually. God has not moved, but it's we who at times have turned our back on him. And sometimes it does take something dramatic, like a pandemic, to wake us up to the fact, to shake us from our complacency and make us fully appreciate that without God there is no hope, there is no meaning, and there is no peace. But with God there is all of those things. In and through Jesus we can have all of those things. And so to those of you watching this who are hurting or struggling or despairing or searching, I want to leave you with the words of Jesus, who said, "Come to me, all of you who are heavy laden, and I will give you peace." Let me pray for you. Father God, I appreciate as I record this, there may be people watching this who are struggling with suffering themselves. Or there may be people watching this who have friends or family who are. Or there may be people watching this who have no kind of faith at all, but are asking questions about what do we do given the kind of world we live in. To all of those people, Lord, I ask that you would reveal yourself afresh. Speak through the words of this message, but also help them discover for themselves what it means that Jesus is the light of the world, that you are a God who is with us even through the darkness of the deepest, darkest valley, and that actually there is true hope to be found in you, even when life is chaotic. Lord, forgive us for the tendency we have as human beings to place our hope in all the wrong places, and help us discover the concrete security and peace and happiness and joy that comes from finding our hope in you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you found this helpful. Do check out the SOLAS website, which is on the top. The URL is on the bottom of the title slide for the lecture. You'll find loads of other resources there we have to help you with this and lots of other issues. And then I hope you enjoy all the other great content that's available this year at Creation Fest. And I hope to see some of you in person in Cornwall next summer.